Hello and welcome. In today's video, we will be looking at the new configurations of the Vcad custom visual that allow us to render runtime federations. First thing, let's have a look at our report template. We've created this report template during the previous video after having defined a runtime federation in the Vcad file manager. Specifically, we created a federation with 3 different Navisworks models, which interestingly means that in our report, not only do we have the information of the, let's call them root Navisworks NWD files that we had, but also the information of the submodels that composed those NWD files. So here we can see we have the specific Revit files that were part of the original Navisworks files. Now, the template, for the most part, looks like a standard Vcad template. So you have things like an asset details tab, the themes, markers, and the tree structure. Where it diverges a little is we have a new tab called Model Info, and we can have a look over here at what that looks like. So here we have the information of how many files are included in our federation, how many source files, because again, we're talking Navisworks models. So not only do we have the 3 federated files, but we also have 5 different Revit files that compose those original models. And then we have the number of asset types available and the actual number of asset instances in our model. And more importantly, our visual is already configured to render the federation. So we can see here we actually have our 3 models being loaded in. You will have noticed not the entirety of the models are being highlighted. It's very evident here in the MEP model. That is, of course, because we've reached the level cap of 90,000 objects in our selection. We could, of course, come here to the options and go over to the viewer options and increase our count cap. But actually, part of what we're going to be doing today is figure out a way to filter these models so that we lower the number of objects and it's easier to manage the federation. So let's actually keep that right there for the moment. Before we address the problem of too many objects being in our federation and kind of potentially slowing down the rendering, we want to have a look at what actually enables us to do the rendering of the 3 models in the first place. So to do that, let's select the custom visual and head on over to the bindings. Here we can find there are 3 new binding options over here. So we have model GUID, which is a reference to the model in the Vcad environment. So what we're passing in here is actually the slot ID, which identifies the model. Then we have the model view. This, of course, is useful if you're federating models that manage views. So in the Navisworks case, it isn't really important. We could actually remove it. But in other file types, it will be required. And then finally, we have the model alignment. Model alignment data basically tells the viewer where the models are supposed to be located, rotated, and so on. And in the previous video, we had a look at how we can define the alignment information through the file manager. We won't get into that today, but just keep in mind that all that configuration that we set up in the file manager is being fed to the viewer through this data binding over here. If we want to see where this data is actually coming from, well, we could just hover over the options and see it's coming from the Vcad asset data set. But let's go over to the transform data section for a moment. Let's have a look at how we get this information into the Vcad asset table. These templates actually diverge a little from the classic Vcad templates in how they retrieve the data. Everything here starts from this multi-model info dataset over here, which is hidden away as a default. You can, of course, add it if you want this information in your report, but in most cases, you won't want to be showing this information by itself. I won't get into all the transformations and how we pulled this data out. You can download the template and sort of review the various steps if you're interested in that. But the important thing to have a look at here is that for Basically every model, here we have a few entries because we have one for each of the data sets, so the asset table, property table, and then our source file, object types, and object names. And importantly, here we have those three columns we were talking about before. So we have the model GUID. So this is the actual Vcad slot ID, so the identifier of the model. We have the model view. This is the identifier of the specific view that we wanted to use when created the template, when we created the federation, and then subsequently downloaded the template. And then finally, we have that alignment data. So this is what it's telling the viewer where the models are supposed to be positioned in the viewer space. And all three of these informations, as a default, we add to the Vcad asset data set. So we can see here we have model GUID, model view, and alignment data. Of course, you can play around with the data however you want, add it to your custom data sets or whatever you prefer. So let's go ahead and close out this data transform section, and let's go back to our custom visual because there's actually a couple options we still need to have a look at. So we've selected our custom visual, and if we go over to the formatting options, here we'll find a new panel called multi-model, which by activating this, we're basically telling the viewer that we're going to be rendering a federation, and therefore to consider the information that is being passed in through these three bindings over here. If we then expand the panel, we can see we have two new optional options. A bit of a tongue twister. We have the multi-model startup filter, and we have the hide not selected models option. So briefly, let's define these two, and then let's actually have a look at how they work. So multi-model startup filter basically will enable us to filter the models being rendered in the visualization. Basically, we'll tell the viewer to only load the models when it first gets booted up, basically. On the other hand, hide not selected models will tell the viewer to always hide the models that don't include objects in our selection, regardless of the hide not selection or X-ray mode settings that we've enabled. Let's have a look at how these work in action, and let's actually start from this last one because it's a little quicker to explain. So I have my three models in here, and let's imagine I have the rest of my report analyzing the data, and I want to review the information using X-ray mode. And so here we can see we get our little X-ray, and if we select, let's say, maybe one of these files over here. So basically we're telling the viewer to select all the objects from this mechanical Revit file that was included in the original Navisworks models. You can see that now here, if we go over to our MEP, everything that is not selected is being ghosted, is being rendered in an X-ray mode. It's probably a little more apparent if we select this other file over here. Yeah, exactly. If we have a look at the electrical, it's a little more apparent. So we can see the rest of the model is being set to X-ray mode, but also the other two models, which have nothing to do with the objects that we've selected, are rendered in X-ray mode. Now in this case, the models are side by side, so that might be a look and feel that we're interested in, or kind of what we want to be applying to the federation. However, if you imagine in these models, if they were overlaid over one another, the X-ray of the MEP and the structure alone could be a bit confusing. If we add the actual architectural to it as well, it can be a little hard to see through all the X-ray. So what we can do is we can select a custom visual, head on over to the multi-model section, and tell it to hide the models, regardless of my X-ray option over here. And so now you can see the two models are nowhere to be found. So only the elements of my of the model from which my selection is pulling will go into X-ray mode. Of course, this works for multiple models at a time. So if I add to my selection objects coming from my structural model, both models will be rendered. Both will be set to X-ray mode, everything that is not selected, whereas my architectural model will be nowhere to be found. So this is more of a helper option to really help you get the look and feel that you're looking at and help you not get too distracted by geometries included in the federation but not part of your selection. That's the general idea. Now, let's instead have a talk about our other option. Let's select a custom visual again over here. So let's talk about the startup filter. So as I said, the startup filter allows us to tell the viewer which models to load and do so only when the viewer starts. So what does that look like? If we reset our selections here, and let's say for now I'm going to select, let's just select the MEP model. Now I want to select a custom visual and I want to actually apply that option. So head on over here. We can remove for now the hide not selected because we want to be sure we're seeing everything that is being loaded in for clarity. And let's go ahead and let's enable the startup filter. Now what happens is if I switch tabs and then come back to my model info, right now I forced the viewer to start up again. And so it's reading the initial selection. The initial selection only contains geometries coming from my MEP model. Therefore, only the MEP model is being loaded in. What is the real advantage of this? Now that we've loaded in the model, the viewer is set up to no longer have to load and unload every time based on the selection. So if I start selecting a subset of objects in my model, you can see there isn't a model load happening. It's very quick. We're simply applying the selection to the desired option. And even if I go ahead and hide everything, it's very fast because the model isn't actually being unloaded and reloaded. However, this has the downside that now if I wanted to switch and view information from my architectural model, I can't do that. So if I switch over the selection to my architectural model, the new objects are being passed in to the viewer. You see the selection count over here changes, and I'm passing in the correct 53K objects like I see over here. However, those objects are not, have no intersection with the model that I've loaded into the viewer, and so I can't see anything. In order to see the architectural model, I have to switch tabs again and force the viewer to start up again. Once again, now the selection has changed, and so it will load in the models that are included in this selection. So in this specific case, the architectural model. You see one out of one, and this is the architectural model. So it's a bit of a balancing that we need to do. We need to decide how we want to be interacting with our model. We have some noticeable increases in performance because of course we're not unloading and loading every time we make a selection. However, we do need to make sure that we've correctly selected the models that we're interested in. This type of approach is very helpful when you set up something like an initial filter page and then a navigation to the actual report page. So let's have a look at how we could set up something like this. It's fairly simple. To do so, let's actually go ahead and we can take the asset page and we can clear out everything that we're not interested in. So we can go ahead and select a few of these visuals. We can remove them. Let's change up the title here. So this will be my, okay, this will be my filters. Okay, this will be my filters page. I can actually rename it here. Switch it over, And let's actually remove the rest of the report tabs. We're not interested in them right now. And make it a little easier to follow along. Okay, so here I want to have my filters page, which will have to include the possibility to select a specific model, a specific submodel, or an object type. So sort of the filters I have over here, which is why we're starting with the old asset page. And then we want to have the navigation. So let's start setting up the actual navigation, and then we can see how we can sort of pretty up the page a little and make it a little more helpful. So to add the navigation, what we want to do is we want to go to the insert section, and here we want to find the buttons, and then we're going to add a navigator, specifically a page navigator. Okay, so this is a very simple page navigator. For now, it's just telling me, it's basically reading the tabs available in my report, and it's giving me an option for each one. And if I click, if I control click on one of the options, the report will load in that specific tab. So I can switch easily between the various tabs. Let's go back to the filter. This is standard Power BI. It's a fairly recent feature. It's a very cool feature, and we're going to really leverage this. Next up, we want to have a way to filter our, let's call it landing page, so the arrival page here under the model info, based on selections that we make here in our filters tab. So here I have a few filters. What I can do is I can actually go ahead and select these, then press Control C, and then switch back over to the model info page. And here, after selecting individual, I'm going to Control V and paste them in. Okay, and here I get an interesting prompt. So now Power BI is telling me, hey, I noticed you've copied some filters from one page to another. Do you want to keep them in sync? As it happens, it's exactly what we want to do. So we're going to simply tell it to go ahead and sync the objects. And what this means is, it's a little hard to see, but basically if I make a selection here, for example, let's remove this filter over here. Okay, if I make a selection over here, so I selected the MEP model and switch back to the filters page, you'll see that here my filter has been updated as well with the same items. Okay, great. Of course, we don't want to be seeing these filters all overlaid over one another like we have them over here. So what we can do is we can actually go over to the view section of the toolbar, and here we want to add a selection panel. And from the selection panel, we're going to find our various filters. Here we go, these slicers, and I'm going to go ahead and hide them away. For a little order, what I could also do is I could group these together, and I could call these filters. Okay. And so now the slicers are actually in the page, but they're not visible. If we go over to the filters, instead here we can see we have our filters. Okay, so now what we can do is, for example, I can select the structural model, and then I can navigate over to the model info, Control click. And when I come over here, you can see over here that I've already selected my structural model. I'm loading one model out of one. Here we go. And I don't need to worry about having to filter that data specifically in this report page. I can do so beforehand on the previous page. Now let's play around a little with our filters page and make it both a little nicer to look at and a little more useful to interact with. So what we can do, for example, let's start from our page navigator. Let's restyle this a little, make it a little more interesting. So for starters, let's see, what we could do is we could change a bit the layout. So let's say we want it vertical. Let's make this way bigger. Yeah, and let's say that my actual buttons here, I want them to be rectangular with a little bit of a rounding, because that's more, that's sort of the style we've gone with the rest of the template. We can resize this a bit and set it over here to the left. We'll probably play a little more with these in a moment. And then let's actually head on over to the filters and let's change this around a bit. So what we want to be doing, I don't know, I want this way bigger, and probably in this specific case, instead of being a drop down, I'll want the vertical list. So I'm expecting there not to be too many options in here. I don't expect I'll be federating 50 models. Of course, this depends on the report you're making. In this case, I know it's only 3, so a list view is perfectly fine. Let's probably give it a bit of a background. It looks a bit better. And as I said, let's round out the corners a bit. Okay, yeah, that's more of the style we're going for. So these are the federated files. Let's do the same thing with the actual source files over here. And we can just copy the style from this one to this one. Again, let's switch this to a list. We'll do a vertical list. Source file type, I know, will only be Revit files. We can actually here over to the filters, go ahead and add a filter and exclude the, I'm going to do select all and then exclude the blank values. Okay, this looks a lot better. And then let's add in the source file over here. Again, I'm going to be copying the format from one to another and switch them to a vertical list. This just makes it more readable for me. It's a little easier to interact with. You'll probably stretch both of these out a bit. Okay. And finally, let's drop in our object type. So we can make this way bigger. This will be the filter that has the most options in it, without any doubt. So let's copy out the values, and here again we're going to tell it to put it as a vertical list. Okay, so now I can really start selecting sort of the things I'm more interested in. So for example, let's say beforehand I don't know which models I want to be interacting with. This is very more likely to happen, specifically if I'm sectioning the model based on areas rather than disciplines, like we do in this case. But say I have my 3 models, and for these 3 models I want to be reviewing, I don't know, we'll do something a little weird. We'll do the analytical beams, let's do the air terminals, and then let's add the columns. And we can see the rest of the filters are sort of reacting to this information. So I know which models are included based on the selection. So for example, if I remove the analytical beams, I can see we're only looking at the architectural and the MEP models. And now what I can do is I can navigate over to the model info page, not the filter page. That's where we already were. We can see these are the 2 files that are being loaded in. I have 86 items coming from my architectural Revit model, and 2,028 items coming from my mechanical model. So we see we're loading 2 out of 2. And now what we could do is we've made our selection. Let's go ahead and add an X-ray view so we can see the items in each. And at this point, we can switch and we could say, okay, I only want to have a look at my columns. We can see here I have my columns. Of course, the other model remains loaded in. So even if I hide not selected, and then I say, okay, now I want to see both of them at the same time, there is virtually no wait time because I don't have to unload the models and reload the models every time I make a different selection. So this is really helping me with performance. So let's have a quick cut and have a look at finally how we can complete the filters page and then review the final result. Okay, so now finally, after a little touching up here of the filter page, you see we've added a bit of a background to our navigation, made it a little smaller, a little nicer to read, and also up here I've added some counters that can be very helpful when you're making your selections to know, okay, I'm loading 2,000 objects, one of the federated files. Let's try making the same selection we had before. So with the columns, we see the number of file races to 2. We can, for example, have a look at a specific here different columns. So we're adding to our asset types and to the number of assets. And then, of course, we're free to select based on the federated model or the source file model as well. Finally, if we actually navigate to our model info, control click, I did just a minor change also here. I've removed some of the visuals we had before, which were not very useful in this specific use case, and I switched with a list of the objects by type as well as the objects by file name. We can see here we're loading our two models that we were interested in, and if we have a look, oops, I actually moved that along, but if we select the information here from one of our models, we can review that data here in our selected models as well. Okay, I think this concludes this. This has been a quick look at the new configuration options for managing runtime federations in Vcad. Thank you for joining us, and come back in the future for more videos on how to use Vcad.